I think one thing that comes through in terms of themes, and we'll get into that a little bit more later, with this early writing, which is often this period of Puerto Rican migration is referred to as the pioneer period, is what you see is an obsession with history. All of these writers are very concerned with the idea of history. I think the example that I gave of the Cuban American Spanish War is an example of that, right? That the Puerto Rican is often eclipsed from history. And so there is this concern with inserting themselves back into history. So just as the Cubans did in that example of changing the name of that war. The questions of fact versus fiction, what genre, how do you read these kinds of texts? What's facts, what's fiction? And how important is that really when you're thinking about the story that these writers are trying to tell? The question of how do we read the stories? These writers are certainly writing in what we might call a pre-literary period of Puerto Ricans in New York. So there's not a literary movement that's taking place like the Nuyorican movement that takes place several decades later, which you'll get to meet a couple of the poets from the Puerto Rican, the Nuyorican writers. But this writing is taking place before that, before any literary movement, and it's taking place within a small community of Puerto Ricans, but it's not a community of artists and writers, although there are a lot of newspapers where this literature is being written, but still we consider this early Puerto Rican literature, right? It's what we have to consider early Puerto Rican literature in the United States.
So were these books published in Puerto Rico at all, or not?
No.
No.
Mm-mm. This writing wasn't published in Puerto Rico. Bernardo Vega's story was actually written much earlier and not published until later. And some of these, and then a lot of these other stories, like the sketches in that blue book, Jesus Colon's book, a lot of those were published in newspapers. I mean, that was a primary forum for Puerto Rican literature at the time, was their newspapers. So they would publish stories, poetry, in these newspapers. And
most of that is in the archives, I guess, right?
yes, you have a lot of it downstairs. Mm-hmm.
Fernando Vega was published by the Centro.
Yeah, but that wasn't until later, right?
Yeah.
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 Well, 20 years ago.
Yeah. So, and you can see it from reading Jesus Colón. So I'm going to bring some of Julia de Burgos' writing as well for us to read. Aside from the poetry, when you read the stories that were published in the newspaper, they're somewhat like short stories, but they don't have fully developed characters. They're more like sketches or vignettes. So in a sense, we would say that this literature, I would agree in that sense also with Juan Flores, that this literature is really pre-literature. It's not fully developed literature like the literature that you'll find by writers of the 1950s, Pedro Juan Soto, René Marquez, which we're going to read an act from that play for next week. The Ox Cart, La Carreta, yeah. So by the 1950s, we do have fully formed literature, and we have the beginnings of literary movements within the Puerto Rican community that in a lot of ways speak to U.S. American literature and also speak to island literature, right? Speaks to both.